All right, it's the top of the hour. This is Steve Woolidge, your host for today. Thank you all for joining. Let's go ahead and get started. Today's presentation is From the Trenches, How Banks Use Data Lakes to Protect Profit. And I'm delighted we have some industry experts, not only from financial services companies, but people that have a lot of experience in data and analytics. Myself, I'm the VP of Marketing at Arcadia, and I'm really happy to have Alistair Anderson, who is an independent financial services consultant who's had a long history at a lot of major multinational banks such as RBS, Aon, HSBC, JP Morgan, and Nordea Bank in Europe. Paul Lashmet works with Arcadia Data as a practice lead and an advisor in and around financial services. He's previously worked at HSBC and Deutsche Bank. So welcome to our speakers today. I'm just going to talk about a few housekeeping things before we jump into it. We will have a fairly interactive session. There are some questions that we'll sprinkle in as we go today to make it more interactive and conversational, and I'd certainly encourage you to also ask your questions of our experts. So you should see a chat or a question and answer section in your online tool there. So just feel free to drop a question as you hear someone speak, and we'll address that for sure. Just a real quick, who is Arcadia Data? If you haven't heard of us, we are a BI and analytics company built in the modern age of big data, really focused on connecting business users to big data systems. So we've taken a fundamentally different approach to the architecture, which is a scale-out, massively parallel system that runs natively within Hadoop and cloud-based data lakes. You can see a lot of our customers here that we work with. Again, multinational large organizations, as well as digital-first companies like Neustar and FinTonic and others. We've been recognized by some industry analysts and press as doing some really cool things in the space, in addition to things like being natively within the BI platform for Hadoop in a recent report from Forrester. Just real quick on what I've seen, I've been in the industry for about 15 years at various database and analytics companies. We all have heard ad nauseum about big data and the volume, velocity, and variety, and it's true, right? There is a lot of new data that people want to incorporate into their strategy to profit and protect their organizations. The platforms have changed, right? People have gone to Hadoop and other systems that give you more flexibility in the schema that can be defined and when it can be defined, how you store that data, how you can maintain the granularity of it, but also do discovery on it before you understand what needs to be pushed into a schema and pushed out in production. I came from the data warehousing world myself. I think we're seeing this design pattern now of data lakes, which are different from data warehouses, and Alistair will speak to that a bit. But what we've seen is that the BI tools really haven't changed. SQL for sure is the lingua franca of business analysts, if you will, but a lot of BI tools still require you to summarize, create extracts, move data out of source systems to get the performance and concurrency and things like that you need. And when you're talking about petabytes of data, that's a little bit of a different problem if you're thinking about a single server or a desktop BI tool, and being able to really do big data analytics is difficult. What we're seeing is that a lot of organizations are choosing modern technologies or new BI standards for the data lake, which are different from the data warehouse. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit today, but more specifically and more importantly, within the context of financial services, the types of applications and problems that are being solved there. So before we hand things over to Alistair to give his perspective, I'd like to just poll the audience briefly here to just get a sense of how mature or where you are in your big data or data lake deployment journey. So Karen, if you could pop up the poll there. There'll be some different questions on whether you're going to be gathering knowledge today, thinking about where this fits in your architecture, if you're kind of in the strategy process, maybe you've already begun a pilot on-prem or the cloud, maybe you've got something deployed or fully operational and in production. So we'll just let this run for a little bit here. And I'll mention another survey that we ran with an industry analyst talking about the maturity of data lakes and what technologies they've been deployed on, cloud versus on-prem, and that sort of thing. We've had over 230 people respond to that have data lakes in production specifically. So there's some pretty good data from that we can also share at the end of the webinar today. So that should be enough time. Karen, if you can go ahead and push the results to everybody, that'd be great just for us to see. I did not see any results. Sorry if I clicked something incorrectly. Can you try it again one more time, Karen, to see if it works this time? Well, I guess we have a little technical difficulty there.
Hey,
Okay.
Steve, can you check it? I think I'm sharing the results now.
I am not, like, I see a window that's popped up, but the results aren't there. So either people didn't respond or there's a glitch in the system. So let's move on. Very good. Thank you for that. Like I said, we do have some data later. So anyway, I'll pass things over now to Alistair to give his perspective. Alistair?
Thanks very much, Steve. What I did see is that 50% of the people were gathering information for a potential deployment, and 25% were piloting. So, you know, my great grip of mathematics tells me that 75% or not of people are yet to deploy to production. So, hopefully, you know, what you hear today will be informative. What I want to take some time on today, because Steve introduced myself, I have worked at multiple banks deploying data platforms at scale. What I want to talk about is what we did when I was working with the various teams that I worked with, why we did what we did, and what benefits we had from those deployments, why the banks you know, did what they did and what they got out of it. So what we're showing here is what we've described as the closed loop data lake architecture. And let me try and explain what that sentence means. So one of the problems that certainly we see, I'm a banker by trade, what we see within the banking industry is that over many decades of technology investment, you find that the demands on that technology investment is rapidly changing. So where maybe 20 years ago everything processed on the mainframe, now the legacy IT infrastructure that's deployed by banks is many thousands of systems. And when you know, a piece of regulation comes along or a digital program comes along that asks the organization to be able to query its data at scale, it's very, very challenging for an organization to run queries on its entire data estate. And that's because data architectures have grown up to become quite siloed and fragmented. And as a result of that, people over the last probably about 4 or 5 years, I would say, within the financial services industry, I mean, longer when you look at you know, maybe the big tech companies, but certainly for the last 4 or 5 years, people have then been turning to data lake type architectures to solve that problem of being able to query all your data in one place. And when you look at building out those architectures, you're really trying to solve a bunch of problems that come from siloed data systems. First of all, you have many multiple points of data consumption. So people can query data from multiple places, and you want to move to a single architecture. You want to move to a synchronized architecture where everybody has access to the same data. But you also want to protect that data in a similar way. So we want to have a single set of security implementations, security controls and protections that secure that data. And then we want to be able to trace what happens to that data through the infrastructure. So the closed loop is really to say that when you bring all your data together, you have to be able to process that data in situ. So whether you use a Hadoop cluster, or you're using a cloud vendor, or you're using some messaging infrastructure, you want to be able to execute on that data in a harmonized way. So what we're showing within this diagram here is the sort of high-level capabilities and technologies and vendors that people tend to deploy within these architectures. So the foundation of it is some sort of data platform, I've been using Hadoop for a number of years now. I see a lot of people that are moving their Hadoop processing into in-memory technologies like Spark. Others are adopting cloud technologies, initially in a hybrid deployment. Some people have gone cloud native. That tends to be quite unusual within the banking industry, but certainly there are other industries and verticals where people are doing that. But that is just the foundation of what they need. And the life cycle tends to be that people ingest raw data. We've picked out StreamSets here as a vendor that we see quite a lot of in the industries. They then have to catalog that data. So here we've picked out Waterline as a partner of ours who helps with that automation of the process. And then we have to allow people to exploit the data. So we have Trifacta Paxata within the Wrangle space and DataRobot within the self-service AI space. What we have to do at all parts of this life cycle is be able to inquire about what's going on in the data. And that's where tools like Arcadia, but Arcadia in particular, do a really nice job. So when data comes in raw, you want to check that everything's loaded. When you're doing your ingest processes, you want to be querying the quality of that information, drawing up dashboards that quantify the quality of the information that's coming through against historical time series. When you're looking at the catalogue, you're looking for adherence to data governance standards. And when you're in the sort of Wrangle and AI loop, you're really hypothesis testing. So you want to be able to query the output of those transformations as quickly as possible. And you want to be able to do that within a single and consolidated infrastructure. For me, the challenges that these sort of platforms address is really the problems that have come from the legacy IT world, where you were copying data all over the place. So from a core transactional system to a data warehouse to a BI system to some sort of analytics system, what we want to do as an industry is move towards far more harmonized architecture. And this is really the approach that we've taken, is to have a closed loop within our architecture that makes sure that all the processing occurs within a single platform. If we can move on to the next slide, Steve.
Yeah, one question while we're doing that, Alistair, is you mentioned some of your experience, and our poll results showed that 65% of people are still thinking about this. I'm just kind of curious, what was your experience in some of these companies in terms of getting business buy-in to modernize parts of the architecture and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, the justification for building out an infrastructure like this really never ends. The great thing about the sort of explosion of data and analytics technology is the solutions are almost infinitely flexible. The bad thing about this technology is the solutions are almost infinitely flexible. So what we did is when we were rolling out the initial data platform, probably about 4 years ago, is we started with a very defined set of business use cases with a very, very defined set of ROI, so return on investment. So at each point of the business justification, we were delivering value. So we did a small pilot on a very specific use case that funded or got support for a bigger use case. Now, we started off in the sort of digital space, customer 360, those kinds of use cases, but that quickly became an agenda that was more a downside type focus. So using customer 360 capabilities to do financial crime intelligence and analysis, powering KYC modernization by bringing in larger data sets and being able to analyze that at scale. So it was always about really agile BI and agile data development, and giving the business a feedback loop that was measured in weeks and days rather than months, and coming back to say, what's next. So building a platform along a general roadmap, but building that platform with ROI embedded into the agile cycles. I mean, I think the days of making IT business cases on the basis of an ROI that you don't see for 3 or 4 years, I think have gone. And therefore, we spent a lot of time making sure that the ROI and the feedback loop for the business was very, very short. And that's what the modern data technologies are really, really good at, is you don't have to make a big bet. You can experiment, test, fail fast, succeed, and then move and decide what your next priority is.
Very interesting. Yeah, incremental approach and agility is something we hear a lot about.
Yeah. So, why does Arcadia do such a good job for us, and why is it, a real, for me, it's become a standard in the platforms that I've developed for business intelligence on data lakes. The really important thing for me is if I, as a technologist within a financial services organization, if I'm going to invest in a bunch of infrastructure, I want to sweat that investment as much as possible. So the fact that Arcadia works natively on the big data platforms, whether it be connecting to Spark or whether it be Hadoop or whether it be in the cloud, the fact that execution leverages the previous and the existing investment within the distributed compute model is really, really important to me. The fact that the data doesn't move anywhere, so legacy analytics platforms, dedicated appliances, they all need you to copy the data. And as soon as you copy the data, you have a governance problem that you didn't have when you hadn't copied the data. You have a security and cyber challenge that you didn't have when you didn't move the data. So processing the data on the same infrastructure in situ is really, really important. The most recent development that we find really useful is that there's been a lot of work with the Kafka folks out at Confluent and really building out the K-SQL standard. As Steve said in the introduction, I don't think SQL is going anywhere. It is the lingua franca of business analysts. It is, when I look at a population of users who use my platforms, I would say 90 to 95% of the usage is SQL. The advanced analytics, the users of R and Python are growing, by all means, exploding, but they're exploding from a very small start point. And therefore SQL and the usage of SQL is just incredibly prevalent, and I think will continue to be prevalent within these platforms. So you really need to be able to serve that up. Now, the work that Arcadia and Confluent have done on K-SQL and streaming is really, really useful for people who want to tap into that real-time. It could be a customer experience, an IoT use case, a transactional monitoring use case, but the ability to tap into data as it flows in motion through the enterprise is really, really useful. To do that in a unified single pane of glass means that all of a sudden people who were business intelligence users and were used to waiting 24 hours to find out what happened yesterday, now can have a dashboard that tells them what's happening absolutely at that point in time, and even start to predict what might be happening. So these are foundational capabilities that leverage investment that's already been made, and therefore make your business justification case that much easier. If you have to justify a dedicated standalone piece of infrastructure, a new silo, that's a hard justification. If you have to justify how you sweat your asset and make your overall technology estate more efficient, that's a much, much simpler justification. Next slide, please, Steve.
Yeah, and as we're shifting, I guess one other question that popped in my head is, you talk about silos and things like that. I'm assuming that the data warehouses that you had in place in previous lives were there, right? And you're creating a data lake.
Yes.
Yeah. But talk about, choosing new standards. You talked about some different tools, and is it fair to say that you created a separate BI standard for the data lake, and why so? Why not use the data warehouse BI tools? I think you touched on some of that, but just.
Well, I mean, the legacy BI tools, they're set up to talk to relational databases. They expect to have a dedicated query-focused instance. Some of the more recent business intelligence vendors are a little bit abstracted for that, but in order to get the performance that they need, they then have, you know, a sort of standalone infrastructure. They maybe bring the data into memory and then work on it, and they have their own formats. I mean, these are all very useful and clever technologies, but what they do is they take the data off the platform, they move the data, and, you know, when we were looking at the architectural principles that we wanted to adhere to within our platform, not moving the data was, you know, one of the biggest ones. We really didn't want to have to copy the data out, because we knew that would give us governance and security challenges that we just didn't want, and it didn't allow us to scale appropriately. And that's where I think Arcadia is really standalone in this instance. I haven't really seen any tool that can scale across a distributed infrastructure the way that Arcadia can. All the other tools that we've tested are really beholden to the execution of a single SQL RDBMS, or pulling it out and then executing in memory. And those are constrained to non-distributed scale-out challenges. So really, for me, Arcadia was the only tool I could find that would scale on the horizontal and not on the vertical. So again, it was another sort of USP of the product for me.
Very good.
Okay.
Thanks for that detail, Chet.
So the technology cases or the technology architectures are very interesting to technology people, but really, you know, what makes you popular in the organization is success or adoption. So when we're looking at, you know, building a scale-out infrastructure, loading lots of data into that infrastructure, the reality is that success is determined by the number of users who get usability from that infrastructure. So to that end, you know, you really need a supporting set of tools that can help the users get value from that data as easily as possible. So if the barrier to entry for using a big data platform is you need to be a statistician with R and Python skills, you have the ability to develop your own statistical models, carry out your own artificial intelligence algorithms, your user population is going to be measured in one hand. If, however, you have a set of tooling that allows people to really pull out data and do correlations, ask questions on their own, and it's a very, very intuitive environment, you have a much larger user population. And when we've been rolling out Arcadia across the community of users, we're finding it's a very low barrier to entry. Anyone who's used a BI tool before just gets it. It's just that simple. People who are new to the environment probably need half a day's training, and then off they go. And for me, one of the biggest success criteria for a technology team is that business users can benefit from the platform you're providing without actually ever coming to you. So really, this sort of idea of we create a platform where people can create their own applications and don't need technology, that was another key success criteria for our implementations, is people being able to do their own thing. Next slide, Steve.
Cool.
So this, for us, what we see within the business users who use the platform, the sort of life cycle, if you like, the business life cycle, is that, you know, they have a question that they want to ask. They want to discover how their data is structured and what values, how they correlate with each other. So there's a sort of discovery phase of what have I got out there. And if you think about it in database terms, which I often do, this is your sort of select star phase. And in the normal world of non-big data platforms, you know, this is what people would do in Excel. They would discover what they've got out there. In the visual analytics world, they would then explore that. So they would graph it out, look for outliers, look for patterns, and then that would allow them to productionize it. But what it allows us to do as an organization when we're rolling out these sorts of platforms is, again, step away from the delivery and allow users to really hypothesis test and have an agile development life cycle are really the same way that the IT teams try to be agile. So to give you an idea of this, I can give a very specific example, which is in our previous implementation, we loaded some data as a technology team. The data load was a couple of days worth of effort. And then we left the business team to really test a hypothesis on themselves. So they were interested in a correlation between rates of returns and customer retention. Very, very basic type of analysis, but something that they haven't been able to do before without multiple months worth of effort. And they went through a hypothesis testing loop and then had a productionized report that could determine what the correlation was between rate of return and customer retention in production within 5 weeks. And that was a real sea change in the velocity of delivery. Really months became weeks. B, the interaction of who does what. The IT team did the basic plumbing. The business analysts were able to self-serve for themselves and do their own hypothesis test. And really, it bred user satisfaction, which in turn bred adoption. So we found that after that example, that whole business unit wanted to get on the platform and have more data made available for them. So it was really quite a virtuous cycle that this discover, explore, and productionize tends to grow usage of the platform, data exploitation, and therefore you get all these kickers in of more people use the data, more eyes on the data, the quality of the information improves, and so does the quality of the insights.
And Alistair, you mentioned Customer 360, customer retention, some of those things, which oftentimes are around revenue growth. Can you talk about some other use cases that you've seen, working in the various banks, revenue protection, governance, those types of things as well?
Yeah, I mean, revenue protection is I would say probably the premier use case within the banking industry, just with the focus on enhanced compliance and making sure that both the banks as an organisation and their customer base as the people they serve do the right thing. So, this sort of hypothesis testing and looking for patterns in data is absolutely ubiquitous within the anti-financial crime space. So we see a lot of adoption of these tools, these platforms, but also this technique of agile data analysis within this space. So looking for people who are breaching sanctions, looking for potential financial crime syndicates. That kind of analysis can really only be done with large data sets, very disparate data sets. So the ability to pull in external information, maybe even social media information, and wash that against transactions. That sort of agile mashup of data and execution at scale really becomes, I think it stands on its own when you look at the use cases within the sort of anti-financial crime space.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for that overview. I think we're going to switch gears and get into other use cases with Paul Lashmet talking about the big data journey. Paul, I'll go ahead and pass controls to you because I know you're also going to give a live demo, which is pretty awesome. And just a reminder to our audience, if you'd like to ask any questions of our panelists, please go ahead and type in those questions into your panel. And Paul, you should get controls here in about 2 seconds.
Yeah, I got it right here. Do you see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And first of all, Alistair, thanks for joining us. It's great working with you again on these sort of things. And Steve, thanks for that introduction. Just a little background further on me is I do come, like Alistair, I do come directly out of the industry, financial services industry. Previously at HSBC, I was at Global Banking and Markets. Before that, Deutsche Bank on the equities desk in Frankfurt, Germany, actually. But one of the things that I've always come across is that in order to make data work, the people need to be able to use it. They need to be able to collaborate. They need to be able to share data, and that's really the perspective I've always gone at when working on this. So what now I'm going to do is sort of go through we talked a little bit about the closed loop, where you're ingesting the data and doing the analytics on it and being able to do visualizations on all that Alistair spoke about. I'm going to sort of work off that and talk about the big data journey in terms of where you're going to be deriving business value at any step of that journey. And so we talked earlier about ingesting the data and storing the data and exploring the data, and that's really where everybody I think starts off first. Especially think about the audience. 75% of the audience are just gathering the information and piloting right now. But after you've explored the data, you want to go the next step of operationalizing it and starting to be able to collaborate across lines of business. And then as you get more mature, then you start thinking about, okay, let's start leveraging what other capabilities we have. Let's start using advanced analytics and streaming data and things like that. And ultimately, in the end, what you want to do is be able to optimize your business processes, to be able to identify new opportunities and revenue streams. So I'm going to go through a few demos, and these first three, I packaged it up a little bit. So this first three really talks about this idea of exploring the data and collaborating across groups. And I'm going to start out with somebody, a business analyst in the front office that's trying to get an understanding of their client, the relationships across all their clients in terms of one large company owns multiple subsidiaries, and we're dealing with a subsidiary, so we want to get a better idea of who is who and who owns whom. And then we're going to look at adding more data, adding geographic data to help understand the global risk, for example, and then going on and saying, okay, now that we have this, let's add transaction data to it and start to delve deeper into understanding how is the business run, or being able to see other types of risks that we didn't think about earlier. And then I'm going to show, if we have time, going down to the end, I'm going to show another example of how you might use where the front office, the trading desk, the finance, and also risk working together to be able to look at forecasting of how their lines of business are doing, and going back and forth and iterating on that. So first of all, I'm going to go to the starting demo. It looks a little complicated, but what you're seeing here is these are on the left-hand side. It's a correlation flow diagram, and what you're seeing is all the interlocking, overlaying relationships of the customers. So in this case, you have one company, this is the parent company, and that parent company owns a number of subsidiaries. And you can see that, so these relationships can get, they're simple, or they can get pretty complicated. And this